Okay, yeah, I guess we can get started. So, welcome everyone. Good afternoon. Remember to submit your questions on Canvas if you want to show that you've been here. Okay, and so we have a great speaker today. So Asha Agrawal is coming from San Jose State University, where she is a professor in urban and regional planning. She's also the education director for the Mineta Transportation Institute. And comes from a highly esteemed background. Got your bachelor's at Harvard, master's in the London School of Economics and Political Science, and PhD at UC Berkeley. Please everyone welcome Professor Asha.
I think I'll stand just so that I can see you all a little bit better, but tell me if I'm blocking slides for anybody. Is this good? This works? Okay, so I was asked to start with just a tiny bit about how I got to where I am. So I grew up in Berkeley. I am the child of a professor of mathematics, so I suppose maybe I was destined to end up as a professor, I don't know. But I had no idea what I wanted to do. I went off to college. I was majoring in what was called social studies, which was a mix of government, economics, and sociology, and I was miserable, and I decided it was all the fault of my major. And I was reading a novel about a folklorist, and I was literally sitting in bed, and I remember thinking, oh, we have a degree in folklore and mythology. And it was a tiny little dorm room, so I didn't have to get up. I just reached over, and that was when you had a phone that was plugged into the wall, because I'm that old, and called, and can I switch my major? So I didn't really know what I was going to do with a degree in folklore and mythology, but it seemed like fun. And I ended up writing a senior thesis on French and Italian fairy tales. And then decided that I didn't want to be a professional storyteller, and the obvious academic next step would be an anthropology degree, and I didn't like post-structuralism and Derrida and all that stuff. So that wasn't going to work. And I took a class while I was an undergraduate it was a fulfilling requirement, and it was on Michelangelo's painting, sculpture, architecture, and poetry. And I hated the class. The professor would put up these slides and say, look at the folds in the robe. And I would look at them and think, well, why are they different from anybody other sculpture? But one day the professor put up this slide of a diagram or plan Michelangelo had drawn for a hill in Rome where there was going to be a grand plaza and staircase and 3 buildings around it. And I remember sitting there thinking, oh, somebody thinks more than one building at a time. And that was just the most interesting idea to me. And back then I had weekly phone calls with my parents, because again, back then it was very expensive to call long distance. And I mentioned it to my parents, who said, oh, you should read Lewis Mumford. He's written about the history of cities. So I read one of his books, and then for Christmas they gave me a book by William White, The Social Life of Small Urban Spaces, which was about kind of micro-urban design and how that can encourage people to socialize and activate spaces. And so I thought, well, maybe I discovered planning. I wrote my master's application in the form of a fairy tale about how I went on this long journey and discovered planning. Did that, had a great year in London, worked for a year for the city of New York in Central Park. I actually had an office in Central Park, which was amazing. But decided, well, I could always go back to Berkeley, not such a bad place to be, and planning. And I was just telling Susan, I didn't really know what within planning I wanted to do, because we didn't specialize in my master's program. And I asked the student advisors if anyone gets any money to support them, and she said no. Well, the transportation students are the only ones who get any funding. So I went home and I wrote my essay. This one was not a fairy tale, but I wrote my essay about how I longed to be a professor of transportation planning. And so they matched me up, with advisors in that field, and here I am. And so it's funny because as a planner, my career has been extremely unplanned, but it seems to have worked out well. And I've been at San Jose State ever since I graduated. It's a teaching-intensive institution, although I've managed to fit in quite a bit of research along the way, and recently have been putting most of my energies into administration. We have an online graduate program in transportation management, which I am directing. So anyway, that's a little bit about me, but soon after I got to Berkeley, I had the amazing good fortune to become a research assistant to this professor who'd shown up, and I just needed a job. But his name was Marty Wax, and he was doing this transportation finance stuff, and I have done other things as well, but kind of never left it. And so Alan asked me today to kind of put together some different projects that I've worked on, and that all relate to how we pay for transportation. In particular, where do we get the money at the sort of public sector level to provide roads, bridges, transit. I'm going to just focus on surface transportation today, not because I don't think transit is important, but it just makes it a little bit easier to think through some of these issues. So, has anyone read The Phantom Tollbooth? No? Oh. It's a children's book, but it is marvelous and great for adults. I highly recommend it. Milo is the main character. And I have titled this From Turnpikes, that's sort of an old-fashioned word for toll roads, to fuel taxes to the phantom toll booth, because I like to think of this mileage fee thing everybody is talking about as essentially a phantom toll booth. And so I want to talk a little bit about kind of the pros and cons and why we might need mileage fees and are they a good idea or not. So just as sort of to step back and to start, if you think about it, road infrastructure is expensive, very expensive. So who should pay? Should it be users, like the people who drive on roads, or it could be, you could think of property owners as users in the sense that if you have a piece of property and nobody can get to it, it doesn't have much value. Or should society at large? We fund education, for example. We don't make individual at the K-12 level, we don't make individual students, pay fees. So, kind of morally, practically, politically, who should be paying? I think there's a strong argument that road users themselves should actually pay a lot, or somewhere between a lot and all of the cost. But that's not actually the way we do it right now. Well, they do pay a lot of the cost. I should take that back. So this is a list, and it's not exclusive. I have no idea how to, does anyone know how to get that?
Let me take a quick.
Off?
Oops, sorry.
No, it's okay.
I think it's in that.
Okay, let's just
All right.
leave it.
Sorry.
Hiding
It
anything.
goes away.
So anyway, this is, we use, frankly, a bewildering number of taxes and fees and charges to pay for transportation if you think all the way from the federal government down to the local level. Now, many of these are taxes on road users. Fuel taxes, which was what I'm going to talk about primarily today, sales taxes on vehicles or vehicle parts, truck weight fees, vehicle registration fees, tolls, parking charges. Some regions have put taxes now on ride-hail services and things like that. We also have some money coming from property taxes, and this would be at the local level. And then finally, they're just other sources of revenue. Cap and trade in California has started to provide a decent chunk of change, franchise agreements with utilities and local governments, sales taxes, hotel taxes. So a lot of them, and especially when you get down to the local level, a lot of it is not user charges necessarily. So we do have, however, a long history of users paying a good fraction of the cost to provide and maintain. The maintenance also costs a lot of money, road infrastructure. So would these phantom tolls, well, I'll call them mileage fees, be a good option moving into the future? And in particular, trying to think through this from a sort of equity and sustainability perspective. When we're thinking about sustainability, I'll focus mostly on climate, but there are a couple of things to think about. One is, basically the more we drive, the more environmental cost there is, including emissions, at least if you're not driving an EV powered by the sun. So can we encourage people just to drive a bit less? That would have clear benefits, I think, in Davis. I probably don't have to belabor that. And then the second is just type of vehicle. And again, some vehicles are going to be more polluting or have more carbon emissions than others. So can we encourage people maybe to drive a little less and to maybe choose a slightly less damaging vehicle from a climate perspective? So thinking about, because tax, and I want to come back to this again later, but anytime we charge people for anything, we are social engineering. We are encouraging people to behave in one way or the other. Not charging also encourages a certain kind of behavior. So given that, why not try and use our transportation funding policy tools to encourage behaviors that will help us achieve other social goals? Thinking about equity, one could have a whole 3-hour lecture on equity and just in transportation, but some of the issues to think about, of course, our ability to pay. Can people who need to travel, can they afford the cost? There's also the public perception of what is fair. We can do sort of as researchers analyses of how much people in different income groups are paying, and that's important, but it doesn't necessarily overlap with what people consider fair or reasonable. So it's useful to, see what society at large thinks. And then also to think about these taxes or fees, like if we weren't doing X, what's the alternative? And maybe a particular fee, like the fuel tax you decide it's regressive, it's, not my dream tax, and yet maybe you can't come up with anything that's better. So trying to think of taxes in comparison with other options. So today I am sort of cobbling together 3 different projects that I've worked on and stitching them together with some other thoughts. So I first want to just quickly talk about kind of the past, present of road user charges, then talk about a project I just finished, which is trying to figure out for California, well, how soon do we really need to replace fuel taxes with something else? Then I'll just briefly talk a little bit more about what these phantom tolls or these mileage fees are. Then a second research project that I did trying to understand if we're going to have one, how should we set the rate? And as a side note, there's been lots and lots of kind of policy discussion and research about mileage fees. Very little of it has dealt with how we structure the rates, which I actually think is one of the keys to the sort of value of these. And then finally, I'm now in year 15 of an annual survey asking adults in America if they would pay more in transportation taxes and fees. So sharing some of what we've learned about mileage fees from those national surveys. And then I'll wrap up. So, transportation user fees, past and present. So our original user fee was tolls, and they go back pretty much as far as we have written history, I assume. There's a nice medieval toll bridge there. But we started in the 20th century. It was, with motor vehicles, there was more and more demand for roads. They were incredibly expensive to build. And the debt was a sense that, well, users should pay, and it was just impossible to have like toll booths, at every corner. And so in 1919, Oregon adopted the very first fuel tax, which was seen very directly as a substitute for tolls. That, more or less you burned, fuel at the same rate as you traveled compared to other vehicles. And so this would be an efficient way to get road users to pay. Idea caught on really fast, and by 1932, the federal government and all the states, wasn't yet 50 states, but all the states were charging fuel taxes. And that's kind of, I would say we've sort of coasted on that for, 90 years, or I guess now we're up to about 100 years. And at least at the federal and state levels, the fuel taxes were sort of the single big source of revenue for roads, highways, local streets and roads and such. But now, and that's sort of what gets us to the first piece of research I want to talk through with you, suddenly the fuel tax doesn't seem like it's doing so well. And at the federal level, for example, there's this idea that we do have something called the Highway Trust Fund, and it is supposed to be fuel tax revenue and some truck weight fees and other things, and that is, in theory, what pays for the federal contribution to roads, except for a number of years now, they've been transferring in general fund revenue. And when I started researching all this 25 years ago, mileage fees were this. Most people are like, oh, someday, 100 years from now, maybe the fuel tax won't work. Well, now, certainly in California, and I think in much of the country, there is a growing understanding that we have to do something. And I would say that the fuel tax has three sort of interrelated problems. There's a tax structure problem, there is a political problem, and there's a technological problem. So here is an example of the tax structure problem. Fuel taxes don't have to be set up this way, but in this country, they have been charged as cents per gallon. And some states in the last decade especially have started sort of adjusting that, but for a very long time, and still at the federal level, it is cents per gallon. And so this is showing us the purchasing power of the federal gas tax, which is 18.5 cents. And it was last raised in 1999. Think of this, if we were all living on the salaries we earned, or your parents earned, or whatever, in 1999. So, and then that sort of leads into the political problem, which is the way we've set all this up, the only way to change the rate is for legislators to actively vote to do so. And especially as the U.S. has become sort of more and more anti-tax, this has just, as you can imagine, not been popular. Now again, some states like California have more recently passed laws where there's some automatic increases and to keep pace with inflation at least, but it's certainly not universal. So we have this problem, the tax money isn't growing with inflation or changing use, politicians don't want to raise it, and then sort of the real nail in the coffin is electric vehicles, what so many of you at Davis are doing all kinds of interesting work studying, because if you drive an electric vehicle, you don't buy gas, and if you don't buy gas, you don't pay gas taxes. And so that huge chunk of money, billions and billions of dollars, even just in one state like California, people are starting to realize, ooh, that's going away. But the question is when? And how much of it are we going to lose, and how fast? And so this is a project that I did with, I want to acknowledge a couple of co-authors. Hannah King, by the way, is a UCLA doctoral student. Bert DeSico is from North Carolina DOT. And we were asked by staff at the California Senate Transportation Commission to look into, well, these California EV mandates, what's that going to do with fuel taxes? And this is actually the fifth study we've been asked to do, sort of along these lines. It's interesting to me that the state is not doing anything much like this. It would seem obvious, but they don't. I think there are probably some sort of political reasons. But anyway, our research question is, well, how will the zero-emission vehicle, the ZEV mandates from CARB, impact future state transportation revenue generated through, and so we've narrowed not to all sources of revenue, but these taxes and fees that were established through Senate Bill 1 in 2017. So there's the gasoline excise tax and the diesel excise tax, and those are the cents per gallon. California also has a separate sales tax on diesel fuel. So we have those 3 fuel taxes. And then there are 2 different registration fees on light-duty vehicles. There's the TIF, which is on all vehicles, and the rate varies based on the value of your vehicle, and the RIF, which is just on EVs. So there's these 5 collections of taxes and fees that we're looking at. I'm not a modeler, so I suppose I have my biases, but my belief is that once you get more than a few years out into the future, we just don't know what's going to happen. And no matter how thoughtful and sophisticated and detailed your work is, it still becomes a guess pretty quickly. So instead of trying to come up with like the guess, because we were asked to look through 2040, we have used a scenario approach. So we say, these are essentially if-then statements. Well, if this set of things happens, what does that do to revenue? And if that set of things happens, what's the impact on revenue? So we came up with this group of scenarios. We have 8 of them. And we play around with a few key variables. And everything else just stays constant. So things like our assumption about gas prices and inflation rates and things like that is constant across all of our scenarios. But we imagine different rates of changes in state population, the number of vehicles per capita we all own, VMT, both light duty and heavy duty, and then sort of the key thing we're supposed to be looking at here is how fast and we're not looking at ZEV sales. We are looking at what is the percentage of the light duty vehicles that we're all driving around that are ZEVs, and the same with heavy duty. So I'm going to just quickly run through, and the sort of numbers don't really matter on these. These are those 6 variables. So for population, we imagined population stays the way it is, that it grows, that it drops. By the way, California has sort of always had population growing, essentially until I think in COVID there was a slight decrease. But if you look now like at the California Department of Finance forecast, they're actually predicting longer term decrease. So we don't know. I don't pretend to know which of these, if any of these lines is correct. But we actually are trying, as we build these scenarios, to maybe push the envelope a little, to imagine things that are a little bit more extreme than sort of conventional wisdom would suggest we consider, so that we have a better idea of what we could face in the future. Similarly, this is light-duty vehicles per capita. By the way, our low one gets us down to roughly the Canadian current rate of vehicles per capita in Canada, which we thought didn't seem that outlandish. VMT for light duty, again, sort of growing, dropping, staying the same. And we could imagine different things happening in the world that would lead to these for heavy duty vehicles. And then here's the light duty ZEV share. So, by the way, there's not even much that's been done in the way of projecting how many ZEVs we will have in the fleet. I still think CARB should do a lot of this, and like buried deep, like 8 layers down in their website, I eventually found is one projection done, but it was a while ago and it's just one, and they don't tell you a whole lot about how they got it. But if we look at theirs, it falls somewhere kind of between our medium and high. So the high is basically that 99% of all of our vehicles are ZEVs by 2040. And then the low one kind of continues past anemic trends, and then the medium one is medium. It's in the middle. So, and then it's for heavy-duty vehicles, it's kind of a roughly similar picture. So then now we mix and match. So we have 6 variables. Those are the rows here. And, those are the columns, population, et cetera. And then the rows are our different scenarios. And we have 3 where we keep low VMT for all of them, sort of the same VMT estimate, but we vary the percentages of electric vehicles. And then in the bottom, it's the reverse. We assume lots of VMT, but different penetration for EVs, and then the middle ones are kind of middle. And we come up with this. So these, by the way, are inflation-adjusted dollars. If you didn't, obviously some of these trends would not look as dire. But in all cases, revenue is dropping. Interestingly, so the yellow ones are the high VMT scenarios. So the very top, number 8, if we had lots of VMT, lots of light-duty vehicles owned, and very little EV penetration, we would only lose a bit, some, but it doesn't look like a catastrophe. But pretty much every other scenario out here, it starts to look quite grim. And if you imagined how much revenue we would be raising every year through 2040, if we kept raising the amount we have, like for this year, we could be, I think it's like $8 billion less per year in the most extreme. So I can't tell you or pretend that I can tell you exactly when we're going to have a crisis, but I think looking at that suggests that, within a few years, we could be losing $1 billion or more in revenue, even under a variety of these different scenarios.
And that's without taking into account any efficiency on regular car, efficiency improvement on regular
We
car.
do assume, I think we basically kind of follow the EPA kind of requirements. So that is in here, yes. And we don't vary that across the scenarios. We just hold that stable. Yes.
And this is just from the fuel taxes.
This is. Let's get to the next one. So this is everything together. So if we add up those 5 different taxes, the next one here is showing us revenue for each of the 5 taxes. And so one of the key things to notice, the gas tax is not only like the most dramatic fall, but it's also starting at by far the highest point. So that's a little under $8 billion for this year, compared to 1.5-ish, I guess 2.5 for the TIF and the RIF for these road fees. So the gas tax really, it is just going away. Diesel is interesting. This is the excise tax, so that's cents per gallon. It drops in every case. Now the sales tax is based on the value of the diesel fuel, so it's both how many gallons you buy and the price. And we use like international, EIA, Energy Information Administration. Yep. We use their assumptions about diesel prices. So you could, if people kept buying a lot of diesel, prices will go up. So maybe we get a little extra revenue. But then the TIF, it depends, based really on how many vehicles we all own, is the sort of one of the key things. But then there is the RIF, and that is the one undeniably everything's going up, and that's the fee on light-duty ZEVs. So this is sort of how it all breaks out. So one thing to sort of realize going back is that these curves, one reason they're not much worse looking than they could be is because we have those fees on vehicles. If we were just relying on the fuel taxes, it would be really scary. So you had a question?
How do you guys calculate the vehicle sales tax fees? Because some of the work I'm doing, the sales taxes for the heavy duty ZEVs, will be like 3 times higher.
So we are only, for sales tax, we're only calculated on diesel fuel sales. So we don't look at the purchase price, the sales on the purchase of vehicles. Is that what?
Yeah, because the state sales tax is like the state plus locals around 8.5%.
Mhm.
And the federal for Class 8 vehicles is like 12%. So if you have a truck going from like $170,000 to $450,000, that's a lot more revenue.
But in California, that revenue doesn't go back into the transportation system. It just becomes general revenue, either at the state level or at the county level. So you're right, you're absolutely right. More revenue would be collected if we have more expensive vehicles, but it's not, at least the way all of our laws are structured right now, there's no reason to think it would get spent on road maintenance.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Okay, so just some conclusions we took away. It's impossible to predict for more than a few years out, again, no matter how good a modeler you are, I would argue. But that it seems like we're probably going to be losing a significant amount of revenue fairly soon. This is not 2 decades into the future that we need to start planning for. And then I didn't highlight this maybe as much as I could have, but if we look at the loss in revenue when we hold VMT constant and we vary the amount of ZEV penetration, sort of the loss there is equivalent to what we see from dropping mileage. So if we hold the percentage of ZEVs constant and play around with high, medium, and low mileage driven, we see equally large drops. So I hope for a lot of reasons we don't all have to drive as much as a state, but that's something that we need to be thinking about in terms of the current revenues just as much actually as the ZEV adoption rates. Okay, so now turning to mileage fees. Remind me what time I should wrap up for questions.
Maybe like 30, 35 minutes.
Okay, from now?
Yeah.
Okay. So back to mileage fees. So what are these phantom tolls? There are many, many different ways that they could be implemented. And so that's one of the first things. With fuel taxes, there are some variations. You could do it as a percentage of fuel prices. We've typically done it as just a cents per gallon. But with mileage fees, there are so many different kind of program design choices, and depending on which version you're talking about, the results will be very different. So one of the things I'm going to talk about the most today is rate structure. And I don't mean the price, but questions of like, does everybody pay the same amount? Or do certain kinds of vehicles pay more or less? There's also how often people have to pay. Some, like Hawaii, has just adopted, actually, it's like they've passed legislation that by 2033, so it's a ways off, everyone will be paying a mileage fee, but it will be an annual fee versus something like the gas tax. Right now, nobody like budgets for the gas tax. We don't have an account for our gas tax payments. You just pay little bits every time you fuel up. So we could have something like that with the mileage fee. How we track people's mileage, and that is a sort of trade-offs between protecting privacy versus not charging people for miles they shouldn't be charged for. Like if you're registered in California and you drive to New York for vacation, you probably shouldn't be paying California mileage fees for all those thousands of miles in other states. And if you're doing something simple like an annual odometer reading, there's no way to prove if you actually were driving all of that in California. And even within the state, there's actually a pilot going on right now. Technically, if you're driving on private roads, you don't pay fuel taxes. So if you have a ranch, a farm, that kind of thing, and you're driving around, you use what's called dyed diesel, and you don't pay fuel taxes. So they're trying to figure out, is the technology good enough that we could tell when your vehicle is on a public road where you should be paying your mileage fee versus off private property. And then there are lots of questions about how people pay. Do you have to have a bank account or a credit card? Do you have a standalone account just for your mileage fee, or could this be rolled into your vehicle insurance or tolls or some other thing you're paying related to your car? So that brings us to study number 2, which was a collaboration with some UCLA folks, a couple of faculty, Brian Taylor and Michael Manville, and a doctoral student, Sam Speroni. And this was something that we had been sort of asked to look into by the California Transportation Commission staff. Like, well, how should we think about rate setting? And I was quite excited once I started thinking about this, because I did realize that it's just not something that's been researched much, and there are not lots of like consultant reports and other things out there. So our goal was to assemble, we were not trying to recommend a specific rate structure, but to try and assemble resources that would help decision makers figure out what kind of rate structure would be appropriate. And I want to emphasize structure, not price. So again, this is not 1 cent versus 3 cents a mile. This is, does everybody pay the same? Do you pay more in congested peak periods? You know, all these different questions about the structure. So we did a lot of sort of literature review in rates, and then thinking about, well, how do rates get set right now in transportation and also public utilities, the behavioral economics literature to try and think about, well, how, depending on sort of how we charge people, might that influence them to drive more or less or buy more fuel-efficient vehicles. And we did a sort of sketch evaluation without numbers, but just at a very high level, trying to think about if we had a variety of different rate structure options, what would the outcome be? And I'm going to go through this quite quickly. But our first finding was that, well, let me backtrack 1 minute and say, in California, the discussion sort of that you'll hear about at like state officials talking or reports on them in the media essentially assumes a flat rate per mile driven for light duty vehicles. I'm just going to talk here about cars and SUVs, not big freight trucks. It just seems to be an assumption that it will be one rate for everybody. California is doing another pilot that is testing 2 different rates, a flat rate and then one that is pegged to the fuel efficiency of your vehicle. By the way, the only reason they're doing that is because I think it was like NRDC and some of the environmental advocacy groups managed to get legislation in to require that it be tested. But if you talk to like the Caltrans staff doing all this work, they do not like to talk about anything but a flat rate. But if you think about it, and here, you know, we charge, if you start thinking about how we charge for parking fees and tolls and you know, all these other things, sometimes we charge on the amount of travel, sometimes on the vehicle characteristics, sometimes on the trip characteristics. Like on a high occupancy toll lane, you might pay something during peak hours and nothing at other times. Sometimes we have charges that are tagged to your like the personal characteristics of the driver or the vehicle owner. There's some places that have transit fares, for example, that are lower if you're low income. A lot of utilities have lifeline rates for electricity or phone service. Sometimes we change the rate based on how you pay. Like the Golden Gate Bridge, I think this is still true, but if you pay, if you have like a transponder, it's cheaper than if you don't. And now they take a picture of your license plate and they mail you a bill, and it will be higher in that case. And then sometimes we charge different rates depending on the purpose of your trip, sort of commercial revenue-raising activities versus personal. Our second finding, which I've talked about a little earlier, is that even a flat rate, whatever RUC structure you have, it will influence behavior. And this is something that, again, I as an academic who doesn't actually have to stand up in front of the public and justify decisions and have people yell at me at meetings, I realize I'm in a different space here. But I find it very frustrating that there seems to be like blinders, this idea that like, well, if we just set a flat rate, we're not impacting people's behavior. It's only if we vary it that we are going to be, sending price signals. And so we think that whatever structure, it will have direct impacts on kind of the environmental performance of the tax, equity outcome, and so forth. And we also think that rate structures can nothing is easy, but it's not that complicated to think through ways we can proactively design rate structures that will collect the money we need, but also help us. It's not going to solve all of our climate problems or equity or anything else, but that will get us somewhat closer to those outcomes that are important state priorities. So when we're thinking about the different ways you could structure a RUC rate, these are the ones we considered, plus one more I have on the next screen. So a flat rate, just everybody pays the same amount. Benefits here, it's very simple for tax collection, for people to understand, and that again is what's being primarily discussed. Something that has not been discussed much, but that is used in some water pricing, for example, is block rate pricing, which I actually think has a lot of potential for road user charges, and I hope people start to think about. Basically, the idea is that you pay some low cents per mile for the first 1,000, 5,000, whatever, the first block of mileage. And then for additional mileage, you pay more. And you could have more than one block, but at the simplest, you just have the low rate and the higher rate. Advantage here is that you give a sort of base amount of relatively low cost travel. So for example, for low income families, they're not paying as high a rate, certainly for base travel. And then there's also quite good evidence. I did another study with this same group of people here, and we looked at California Household Travel Survey data from 2017, so it's a bit outdated. But the highest income households in California drive 60% more miles than the lowest income, on average. Of course, there are individuals for whom it's different. So, you could... The people who would really be paying those higher rates would probably be middle and upper income. An axle weight rate. So this gets into kind of the physics of road damage, but the heavier your vehicle, and in particular per axle the weight, the more road damage you do. I'm not an engineer. What I'm told is it's pretty similar among most light duty vehicles, but the real difference is if you're a big truck versus a car. So you could have a rate that is gradient on different axle weights, and you could charge something different for small passenger cars and then the heavier ones. Congestion rates, you could have maybe regions which charge more if you're driving in a congested peak hour conditions. What I'll call a carbon rate, but that could just be pegged to the fuel efficiency of your vehicle, or an equity rate where the rate would vary by the driver's income. And again, we do have some precedent for that with some transit fares and then more with electricity and utility pricing. Finding 4 is, and this is actually something that I came to sort of feel more strongly about through doing this project, is the value of a RUC is really not just to raise a lot of revenue. I mean, it could do that, but it's a very cumbersome, expensive way. There are some privacy concerns. If you really just want to raise revenue, there are probably better ways to do it. But if you structure your RUC system appropriately, you can help achieve a lot of these other benefits. And so the rate is really critical to how valuable the program will be. We recommend that you consider a number of criteria when choosing your rate, which includes what is the purpose of your tax. Do you want to try and reduce carbon emissions or other things? Certainly looking at equity and administrative feasibilities. Second thing, does anyone here know what a highway cost allocation study is? Nobody? I'm not actually that surprised, but a little. I would have thought at least a couple people. So these have been done for 100 years, at the federal and state levels. And the first one was in something like 1923. It's actually very interesting to read. It almost sounds like it could be written today. But basically the idea was different vehicle types, like if we were comparing, let's just say, a car and a truck. What are the costs that these two vehicle types impose on the transportation system? Like we have to build heavier pavement to support trucks. And they tear up the pavement faster. And so the idea was that you would do this study where you would kind of define your vehicle classes, you would determine the costs that are imposed, you'd also look at the revenue that each vehicle class is paying, and you would end up with the so-called equity ratio, which was, and one would mean you're paying as a class exactly the costs you're imposing. And these have been used to help set, like, fuel tax rates is one of the key things. Actually, the federal government and California, in theory, are both in the process of doing new ones, although not much is happening. But I think these can be a really useful tool to help us, if we are going to move to road user charge, to think about, are there ways we can sort of fairly pass along the actual costs a group of road users are doing. Recommendation 3 is stay away from a flat rate structure. It's very simple, but it seems to me like, it is very problematic from a climate and environmental perspective. Basically, you're just raising the cost for everyone driving an efficient vehicle and lowering the cost for everybody driving an inefficient vehicle. Look for ruck rate structures that try to account for these multiple costs. And so, I thought I had put in, maybe I'll come to it. Let me just try and, I'll come back to my thought of how we could have a more complex rate structure like that. So now let me turn, though, to the third study, and this is actually 15 years of work. We're running the 15th survey right now. This is done with Hillary Nixon. And we have been surveying the U.S. adults about whether they would support raising the federal gas tax rate. Back when we started this, that was of a lot of interest to people. But we had, even right from the beginning, some mileage fee questions. And the assumption, certainly when we started this, was that if you said the words mileage fee in a public meeting, you were going to have things thrown at you, and you would be voted out of office, and terrible things would happen. So is that true? That was one of the things we were interested to find out. So actually we're in the middle of doing the 15th survey right now. Early ones were phone, and when that just got too expensive, we switched over to online samples. The number of respondents per survey has ranged from 1,200 to 2,790 something. And we also collected a lot of other data on sociodemographic characteristics and people's opinions about quality of their transportation system, their travel behavior, and such. So just looking at the most recent one, it was collected February, March of last year. We had about 2,500 respondents, and So I'm going to give you mostly some quick highlights of the results from that most recent survey, but I'll also show you a trend or two. So we had two kind of primary mileage fee questions, a flat rate one and what I call the green one. So this is what people saw in the survey. Imagine that the U.S. Congress decides to replace the gas tax with a mileage fee of 3 cents per mile driven. That means someone driving 10,000 miles a year would pay $300. Vehicles would have an electronic meter to keep track of the miles driven. Would you support or oppose replacing the gas tax with such a mileage fee? And we found last year 45% support. Now, there was also the green version, and here the survey says, a variation on the mileage tax just described is to have the tax rate vary depending on how much the vehicle pollutes. On average, vehicles would be charged 3 cents per mile, but vehicles that pollute less would be charged less, and vehicles that pollute more would be charged more. Would you support or oppose? And we found 51% support. And now I want to show you, this is our trend. So the green line on the top is the green, variable rate. The blue one on the bottom is the flat rate. So a few interesting things to me. First of all, the green line is always on top of the blue line. Always. We had a higher proportion of Americans telling us they would support a mileage fee with the variable rate than the flat rate. So I find this particularly annoying when I go to public meetings and things and I'm told like, oh no, the public wouldn't possibly have anything other than a flat rate. Maybe, but it doesn't seem to me like we should write off the alternative. It's also interesting though, you'll see there has been an increase in support for both over the years. It's, kind of bounces around a little, but it's going up. And then there has been this narrowing, like now the difference between the two taxes is small, whereas it was really stark when we started this project. We also have looked at sort of the personal characteristics of, are people of different types more likely to be mileage fee champions? Basically, being young, you are more likely to support the mileage fees if you're younger than 55, if you live in an urban area, if you sort of lean to the Democratic Party, and interestingly, if you use transit, which I'm sure overlaps with living in an urban area. But what we also found is there were not large or sort of consistent variations according to some of the things that people worry about from an equity perspective, like income, race, gender, and ethnicity. And this is just to give you a couple of examples. So the two charts over there are comparing support for the flat rate mileage fee and the green one for our 3 different age groups. And so what you will see is that certainly here for the green mileage fee, these are the 18 to 34-year-olds. Like there's a very clear pattern. Like you are much more likely to support this if you're younger than if you were older. And even up there, it's not nearly as stark, but in general, that youngest group is on top. So there seems to be some consistency with age. This, however, is income, and they're all just kind of clustered together, and I would have a very hard time with a straight face saying that clearly people of a certain income group are much more likely to support or oppose mileage fees. So we also asked some questions directly about rates. What rate do you think that electric vehicles should pay? And our choices were the same as gas or diesel. That was basically half, 49. Half the rate for gas or diesel, third, and nothing, no fee, and that was 16%. We asked about the block rate option I mentioned before, and just to give people a number, we said it would be 5,000 miles at the lower rate, and it was, again, pretty close to 50-50 split on that. So it's not like there's overwhelming excitement about the block rate, but I also don't see any evidence that this would just be like a nightmare as a politician if you proposed it. And we asked about a preferred rate if people thought low-income drivers should pay less. And here we got, by far the kind of starkest difference, 63%. So pretty close to 2/3 thought that low-income drivers should pay a lower rate. We also, so in here, let me just kind of wrap up. So I know I've thrown a ton of things at you, but is a mileage fee a good replacement for fuel taxes? It is a user fee, which just inherently has some level of fairness to it. And I would say maybe. I couldn't say, yes, it's a great idea or a bad idea, because it depends so much on how you structure the mileage fee. There are ways that you could make it a terrible idea, and ways that it could potentially not only raise the revenue we need, but help us move towards some other important goals. Thinking in terms of equity, we could do things like those cost allocation studies and try and peg the rate you pay fairly closely to the costs you're imposing. And what are those costs? Well, it could be road damage, it could be air pollution, it could be noise, it could be safety. And then we also could reduce costs for low-income drivers. With the gas tax, you can't charge people less unless you, like at the gas station, have people showing evidence of their income, and that's not happening. Whereas it wouldn't be that hard to do it with a mileage fee. And then in terms of climate, you could definitely structure your rate to send a price signal to people that maybe drive a little less and maybe drive buy a few more fuel efficient vehicle, or if you're a household and you have a few vehicles, maybe use your most efficient vehicle or your EV for the most amount of driving. So I did, as part of the second project I talked about, we came up with what I called the everything rate. And it's sort of complex, although not necessarily. So let me talk through. We'd have these different components. And the numbers, by the way, are purely we just kind of picked something. I'm not advocating for those exact numbers. But we could charge a base rate of penny per mile that everyone pays for common costs. Like, we all need stop signs and traffic signals, and there are other things. It doesn't really matter if I'm an 18-wheeler or a small car. We all need some basic infrastructure. Then you could have a road cost component, which would be designed to contribute to the sort of construction of a road to accommodate your vehicle, and then the rehabilitation and maintenance. And maybe that ranges from a penny to, 4 cents a mile. Again, the numbers are very hand-wavy. What I would call the carbon component, and this could be covering cost of greenhouse gas emission reduction programs or state VMT reduction programs. And maybe we varied it from 1 to 6 cents per mile based on fuel efficiency. And then you could have a local add-on where maybe counties or MPOs could decide that maybe the San Francisco Bay Area wants to add a penny a mile or something for regional needs. And so if we added all of these up, we could get a range from 3 to 13 cents per mile. I'm told that, and I do believe that if it gets too complex, it becomes problematic for the public, for elected officials. I'm not sure, though, that this is that complicated to understand. To me, it seems like you could show somebody and say, well, if you're buying a Honda Civic, you're going to pay here's what you're going to pay. It doesn't seem to me that confusing. And then you could, if you wanted, overlay, a discounted rates for low-income drivers to help deal with the equity issues. So I do think that there's a lot to be said for a RUC, but that we don't want to just blindly jump into it. And I haven't talked about administrative costs and the privacy issues, but those are real concerns. They can to some extent be dealt with, but they're not nothing. The fuel tax, by the way, costs almost nothing to collect because it's collected from refineries. So you just have a handful, literally, of taxpayers in a state. Whereas if you move to RUC, every vehicle owner is now, you're having to collect revenue from them. And I'm assuming probably the slides will be shared, and so these are just a bunch of some of the different things I've worked on that could be of use. So.
Okay, as per tradition, first question from students.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for this presentation. I was wondering about the congestion rate you talked about.
Mm-hmm.
Is it meant to be some sort of a TOU rate that knows congestion periods on major routes and bills accordingly, or would it be like a dynamic real-time congestion rate
So,
using real-time congestion
Right.
data?
I mean, great question. I don't have like a strong, I haven't researched that, so to speak. I would say that when it comes to changing people's behavior, there's some value in having like schedules so that I can plan ahead. The flip side of that, of course, is that you can manage the congestion much more efficiently with a dynamic rate. So pros and cons of each. Actually, one of the very earliest pilots was done in Oregon, road user fee or mileage fee, and they actually did have like a peak period and an off-peak period rate as part of their project. And I worked with an NYU faculty member, and we did find that the people who had, there was some movement out of the peak hour, not huge, but there did seem to be some shift that presumably would be a benefit from congestion.
Can you just go back to your slide? You didn't have congestion pricing as your everything.
In this one,
Yeah.
not
Okay.
directly, although the local maybe, but yeah, you could sort of add yet another seed or flavor onto your everything rate.
Yes, Doctor. Number one, great presentation, very relevant to what we've been talking about in the program and in some of the courses that we are taking right now. So when I first read about road user charges in 2021, my immediate thought was, why has there not been a petri dish experiment somewhere in the United States?
Mm-hmm.
And so 3 years later, I still have that same question. But maybe one thing for us to consider is some of the advising that the state of California has given to our counterparts in China
Mm-hmm.
in terms of implementing policies that California has implemented and allowing our Chinese counterparts to implement them locally. And so that's really one area where the Chinese government has really incentivized their provincial governments and citywide governments to really experiment with different transportation issues. And so this may be one area of advising. Maybe the state of California can advise our Chinese provincial counterparts.
I have no idea, by the way, how transportation taxes and fees work in China. And if anyone wants to share something with me later, I would love to learn more about that. By the way, Europe is doing, they now have essentially mileage fees for trucks in a lot of countries. New Zealand now has a mileage fee for all diesel vehicles. It used to just, so there's more happening. The U.S. actually does, we have something like 23 states now, I think, that have either done a pilot or at least a formal study. It's still, I would say, lukewarm. Although, interestingly, I think one assumption is that it's going to just fall by party lines. And Utah is one of the only states that has actually adopted a mileage fee. It's just on EVs. Oklahoma is just wrapped up a study of mileage fees. So it's kind of interesting. I think my sense is that we've reached a tipping point with EVs where suddenly people can't just pretend it's 20 years out. Up until now, I think it was just, and no, what legislator likes talking about taxes? It's just not, you're never going to make people happy, really, by passing taxes. So I think it's easy to punt. And this is a little different, but I did another project where I interviewed a bunch of local government experts on funding and where future funding had come from. And they would all complain about the kind of apportionment system, like what percentage of money went to rural counties or urban. And so I would say things like, wow, well, if we adopted a mileage fee, that could be like rethought, or just even should we rethink the apportionment of gas tax revenue to a person? They're like, no, it might get worse. Like, it was interesting. None of them seemed to feel like maybe if we rethought it, it would be better and it was a risk worth taking. It was just like, no, at least I've got what I've got, and I'm afraid I'll lose even more. So.
And at the federal level, there's also the federal mileage fee committee or mileage tax committee,
Which has still not been established.
Yeah, are you? I was going to ask.
I have nominated myself to be on it.
I hope that you get it.
I do too. That was an interesting political learning experience for me because you have to apply, and I talked to our legislative federal guy on campus, and I started talking about I have all this research experience on mileage, and he's like, no. If you run the letters of support from our local congressional office, we have to talk about how your being on the committee will benefit them and benefit our region. And it really doesn't matter. So that was kind of.
You don't have to know anything.
Kind of. I mean.
Yes, a disadvantage.
Yeah, but it was a good reminder to me of sort of how politics works. Yeah.
So the federal excise tax for trucks actually does go directly into the federal highway trust.
Oh, the federal taxes, the sales tax on truck parts and truck sales.
Yeah, so that's around $5 billion in revenue per year up to 40 billion. So if you have that going up, let's say doubling, even tripling, I don't think that's a wild assumption. You think that would make the picture look a little less bleak or not really?
I think it would help at the margins, but I think that's such a small drop in the bucket compared to the fuel taxes is my.
Well, I mean, the gas is 25 billion, the diesel's 10 billion, and that's 5.
But that's an excise tax, right? Not a sales tax. Is that
It's
right?
a 12% sales tax on the first time purchase of the truck.
Oh. Okay.
So I guess it could. I have not thought about that, quite honestly, because we were just not looking at that. So, if I had to bet, I would guess that we're gonna electrify our light duty vehicles a lot faster than the trucks. But that's a good point, and I hadn't thought about that before. So thank you. So.
I was wondering if between the light and heavy, did you consider a surcharge or on top of it for SUVs and passenger light trucks? And how would your survey numbers look like if a 0.5 cent or around that was added as a surcharge for an SUV or a passenger light?
So that's an interesting question. My guess is that if we described it that way, it would not be popular. However, people liked the idea of basing it on pollution, which is kind of our general public proxy for emissions and climate. And the other thing, so I think if you could come up with a reason to do it, that might happen to charge more for light trucks. It might go over, but my hunch is it would not be popular. I mean, the percentage of new vehicles sold, it's 2/3 light duty, SUVs, and I mean it's most new cars.
Yeah, 2/3, about 2/3.
The other thing though that occurs to me, and I don't know, safety is very popular. So, and there does seem to be pretty good evidence that taller vehicles and heavier vehicles, so that includes a lot of EVs, pose more of a safety risk. So another thing you could do is have a component that kind of relates to the risk of your vehicle imposes. And again, without calling it an SUV or a light truck tax, you might kind of get at the same thing.
I think they enacted one in Paris, and it's a fixed, charge.
And actually, they did it on parking.
Yeah.
But actually, Washington, D.C. now, I think, charges more to park. They've either passed it or they're trying to. I can't remember now. but for like parking fees for big vehicles, and it's true, it takes up more space, you know? I mean, if you think of it.
It's interesting how they're going to measure which one is big enough to come with a ruler and stuff.
Yeah. Although in Paris too, if you live in Paris, it doesn't apply to you. It's like $200 a day to park an SUV in Paris if you're driving in from outside. So it's taxing foreigners who live abroad, which is everyone's favorite tax.
Great that you combine all three together, but I will go to 4, 5, 6. And my question is, how do we cross this 20, 30, 40 years of having both gas tax and water mile tax? Or do we stop taking gas tax? Because we will have a mixed fleet for forever. And when it's come to EVs, it's looked like everyone that try to tax EVs is the more than anti-EV than pro-roads. And
I actually think we probably should
Utah?
have both.
Yeah.
I mean, but this is in California, again, if you go listen to like the Caltrans staff, they will say this is a replacement for the gas tax. We are not double taxing you. And I can see the kind of messaging.
But the government is sending me check for buying EV and then asking me for writing a check for driving
Well, we
EV.
could say
Why
that-
the government is not giving each other the check and leave me out of it.
So, but we could argue that if you bought your EV and then you never drove it, you're not creating costs that the, Caltrans and your local DOT have to, cover. So it makes sense to maybe have both charges. I actually think keeping the gas tax, I used to be very opposed to the idea of a mileage fee just on EVs because I thought it would just discourage people from buying them. I think we're maybe getting past that. And then it might make sense just to have both. Or instead of having this, you could have everybody paying the mileage fee without a carbon component, and you could have the gas tax. But then it does raise the kind of slogan of double taxation, and
Hi, thanks for your presentation. I was wondering if you thought about how support might vary, like if people had some type of baseline comparison of like what they would pay for the gas tax, because I thought it was like promising that the low income policy had like a really high support, so I thought like if you had evidence that people were like willing to pay more, that could also be a good like policy.
So that's an interesting and very sensible line of thinking. Americans have no idea how much they pay in gas taxes. And to be fair, if you ask me what I pay in like taxes on my water or other infrastructure that I don't study, I have no idea. So we have given up. We have tried many years in our survey to ask people, how much do you think you pay in taxes? And we've asked it like, in a year, how much do you pay? Or what percentage fraction of the price of a gallon of gas do you think is taxes? The answers are so wildly, people say I pay $4,000 a year in taxes, or 2/3, we've just given up because clearly people don't know. The one thing we do keep asking, mostly because it's fun to show to a bunch of transportation funding wonks, is we ask people when they think the federal gas tax rate was last raised, and we give them some categories. 2%. Year after year, 2% of people correctly say that it has been more than 20 years. A large chunk say, I don't know, which is quite honest of them, but, people just don't know. So there have been some efforts to do focus groups to talk to people about how much do you currently pay with the gas tax, and, why do we need to replace it? And usually those education efforts seem to have some impact, people are maybe more open to the idea of a mileage fee once they understand what they're already paying. And also that the mileage fee isn't going to be $3,000 a year or some huge amount of money. At least if we keep it such that we raise roughly the same total revenue that we currently raise. If we went to a European style of taxation, for example, then it would probably feel very different.
Hi. So you say that there's an increasing public awareness that the traditional gas tax funding model is unsustainable.
I would say it particularly along like decision makers, not as much the general public.
Okay.
Although once you explain it to people, it's not hard to understand.
Right. I was gonna say that in recent years in California we've had SB1 and then at the federal level there was the 2021 infrastructure bill. Would you say that like the lack of apparent austerity in our transportation investment might be limiting people's awareness of the necessity?
That's a very interesting question. I think that some of the like people who are just very anti-tax would point to that, but I think most people, at least in California, drive around and they're like, I'm damaging my axle on the potholes, like our roads are a mess, what's wrong, you guys are incompetent, fix my roads. So I think that they may think that Caltrans is not being as efficient as it could, but I don't think they see the system as a wash in money, unless they're sort of just in general predisposed to think government is untrustworthy and wastes my money and I'm overtaxed. So it was interesting. I took vacation over holidays we went to national parks in Utah, and I was like, the roads are so good. They're so smooth, and like the signs are where you want them, and it's like so much better than California.
Okay, so you and I have both been to all of these CTC meetings, and
Yes.
you've been alluding to this, where they say, no, like it's gotta be just for the roads, we won't wanna address these other things, and I kind of see this and the kind of dichotomy between, what a lot of like us academics are saying and versus what, well, specifically the California Transportation Commission, right?
Right.
Like how do we get there, like with that kind of resistance?
Are they the ones who have to approve it?
No.
Not necessarily, but I mean they are the champions for implementing this, right?
This goes back to how much impact does all this research have?
Yes.
And if you're being even slightly cynical, you'll say not much. That legislators this is going to come from the legislature ultimately, and that they make decisions, like their staff look at some of this stuff, a few of them might want to talk to us, but basically they don't care too much. I will say, and you always wonder as an academic, does my work have any impact? And then State Senator Jim Bell has told me many times that our survey convinced him to structure SB1 the way he did, and the word maintenance was in the title. And I didn't talk through it, but a large part of that survey looks at if people would support gas tax increases. And we asked, well, what if the increase was for safety? What if it was for maintenance? What if it was for congestion? Maintenance, 2/3 of people say, I'll pay 10 cents more per gallon for better road maintenance. And so here is a case where at least a little fraction of the work got used. So I think it's probably a matter of trying to lobby the elected officials.
Getting this to the right person.
Getting our students working at those agencies.
Yeah.
After we have brainwashed them.
Yes.
And I do, I'm sort of complain about the CTC and all of that, but I do understand. I don't go to meetings around the state and have to describe this, but at the same time I find it frustrating that I feel like sometimes the staff are just completely ignoring some very, very basic facts, like more people say they'll support the green version than the flat version, and year after year after year, shouldn't we at least consider it?
All right, and so with that, we're kind of at the end of our time. So everyone, please give another round of applause.